Thank you very much for staying tuned at Smart24 TV. My name is Anthony, and you're still watching Financial Markets with, of course, Smart24 is a channel that will give you business 24/7. None other channel in Uganda has been able to do this that Smart24 is doing. So keep tuned at Smart24 if you would want to keep updated in the world of business and getting to know what's happening in the business circles in Uganda and in East Africa as well. Now, we are still looking at the quarterly bulletin for the second quarter of the year 2022 and analyzing how things changed depending on the last quarter, that is the quarter for the first quarter of 2022, and also looking at last year's second quarter. Now, we are going to cross over to the equity market performance, and we are looking at the secondary market activity. Now, when we talk about the equity markets, we are talking about the stocks, looking at companies and how their stocks have been able to perform. Now, the Uganda Securities Exchange total market capitalization for the second quarter of 2022 fell by 12.8% to 19.7 trillion at the end of the review period from 22.6 trillion at the end of March 2022. This decline was due to share price losses on 6 cross-listed counters, including Centum, Jubilee Holdings, East African Breweries, Kenya Commercial Bank, Equity Bank Limited, and Nation Media Group, and the 6 locally listed counters, that is Cipla Quality Chemical Industries, Bank of Baroda Uganda, Stanbic Bank Uganda, Uganda Clays Limited, MTN Uganda, and DFCU. On an annual basis, the total market capitalization decreased by 5.3% from 20.8 trillion at the end of a similar period in 2021. This decline was due to the share price losses on all the cross-listed counters: Centum, Nation Media Group, East African Breweries Limited, Jubilee Holdings Limited, Equity Bank Limited, KCB, and Kenya Airways. And the 6 locally listed counters that led to this loss were British American Tobacco Uganda, New Vision Printing and Publishing Company, Bank of Baroda Uganda, Cipla Quality Chemical Industries, and Stanbic Bank Uganda, as well as Development Finance Company of Uganda. Now, the graph on your screen is just showing the quarterly trends in the total market capitalization on the Uganda Securities Exchange, and that is starting from the second quarter of 2018 to the second quarter of 2022. That's for the last 4 years, and those are trillion Ugandan shillings. Now, when you look at the year 2018, the market capitalization was quite high, actually the highest, at 28.56 trillion. It went down to 25.9 and then went down to 23, went back up to 24, went down to 22, and then down again to 21, and then up back again to 24 trillion, and then went to the lowest point where we're seeing at around 18.21 trillion in the first quarter of 2020. That was the lowest market capitalization we've seen in the last 4 years, and then went back up to 19, and so on and so forth. But the market capitalization fell in the second quarter by 12.8% to 19.7 trillion Ugandan shillings, compared with the previous 22.6 trillion for the first quarter of 2022. Now, away from the market capitalization, the domestic market capitalization, that's the total market capitalization, but when we look at the domestic market capitalization, which represents the value of the locally listed stocks, it fell as well by only 2.9% from 7.4 trillion to, at the end of the March 2022 to 7.1 trillion at the end of the review period. This decline was attributed to the fall in the market capitalization registered on 6 locally listed companies. These included Cipla Quality Chemical Industries, who lost value by 22.5%, then Bank of Baroda Uganda, who lost value by 11.5%, and then Stanbic Bank Uganda, who lost value at 12%. And then you're looking at other counters like MTN Uganda, who lost by 1.1%, and as well as DFCU Bank, who lost by 0.9% loss there on the market. And we can have a look now at the quarterly trends in the domestic market capitalization. You can have a look at that graph there, and you're seeing that in the first quarter, the second quarter of 2018, there was about 4.78 trillion. Very, very low. I think the lowest, not the lowest really, but one of the lowest. And then when you look at the trend there, it went up to 5.71 in the third quarter and went back down and then remained stagnant from the third quarter in 2019 to the third quarter in 2021. Very stagnant there, between 4.4 to 4.28 trillion Ugandan shillings. However, in the fourth quarter of 2021, you're seeing that shoot up there, up to 8.52 trillion. That's definitely as a result of MTN Uganda, who was getting listed by then in the fourth quarter of 2021. That was on the 6th of December. And that drove the market capitalization upwards to 8.52 trillion Ugandan shillings. And then later on, we are seeing a decrease because of the decline in performance of these few companies. We've seen here it went down to 7.36 and 7.14 trillion. The changes in the domestic market capitalization mirror the changes in the price of the domestic counters, whose drivers are discussed, of course, later on in the bulletin. On an annual basis, the domestic market capitalization grew by 64.9% from 4.3 trillion at the end of a similar period in 2021. This growth was mainly due to the listing of MTN Uganda on the 6th of December 2021 and the increase in the share price of 3 locally listed counters, that is Uganda Clays Limited at 131.7% increase and Wumeme at a 9.1% increase, as well as National Insurance Corporation at a 3.4% increase. That, of course, puts us to the end of the quarterly trends in the domestic market capitalization. Away from that, when you look at the market turnover, looking at turnover is a different also angle of looking at this the stock market. As we've said, the capitalization looks at the total value, monetary value of shares by multiplying the unit cost of a share, or the share price, times the total number of shares that are available. Now, when you look at the equity turnover, that is the total trades that have been transacted at the USE, soared by 87% in the second quarter of 2022 to over 13.7 billion from 7.3 billion shillings registered in the previous quarter of the same year, 2022. Average turnover per session rose to 208 million per session in the period under review from over 122.1 million recorded in the first quarter of 2022. The increase in market activity can be attributed to among other things, uptick in investor activity, with a majority of the targeting dividend payments, of course, of the listed companies that have been, of course, issuing dividends, were issuing dividends back then in that quarter. On an annualized basis, the total equity turnover at the Uganda Securities Exchange increased by 129.5% from over 6 billion in the second quarter to over 13.7 billion in the review period. Now, that is on annualized basis. The turnover, the total value of money that was transacted, increased from 6 billion to over 13.7 billion, which is a 129.5% increase there in the review period. Now, the increase in turnover can also be attributed to, among other things, the increased participation from institutional investors, driven by the improved sentiments as economic activity picks up within the same period. Now, when you look at the table here, you're seeing the quarterly equity turnover per counter, looking at how much each counter was able to trade. Bank of Baroda, British American Tobacco in the first quarter traded only 6.8 billion, whereas in the second quarter 2022 it didn't have actually any turnover that it traded. Bank of Baroda traded a total of 2.1 billion within the second quarter, compared to the 106.9 billion in the first quarter of 2022. Centum Investments only traded 1.1 million within the second quarter, whereas Cipla Quality Chemical Industries traded 6.9 billion and millions. And then DFCU Bank only traded 1.8 millions, and KCB didn't trade any at all, whereas MTN Uganda traded 1.8 billion Ugandan shillings there, and that's compared to the 1.6 billion that was traded the year before, in the first quarter of 2022. And then National Insurance Corporation traded 11.4 million compared to 9.1 million in the first quarter, where there was an improvement. A New Vision Printing and Publishing Company, on the other end, lost some money there, because it traded only 3.3 million compared to 8.3 million that is in the first quarter. And then Stanbic Bank Uganda traded over 221.5 billion, also declined from 2.2 billion shillings that was traded in the first quarter. UCL, Uganda Clays, also lost some amount, declined in some amount, that is from 403.6 billion in the first quarter to 261.6 billion within the second quarter. And Wumeme increased by a very big margin from 2.5 billion in the first quarter to over 9.2 billion in the second quarter. Now, definitely putting that aside, we look at the index levels. The Uganda Securities Exchange index levels lost, that is 12.7%, to close the second quarter of 2022 at 1,149 points, from 1,316 points reported at the close of the previous period, that is in the quarter registered in the first quarter of the year 2022. The all share index declined as well as a result of the share price losses registered on the 6 cross-listed counters, that is Centum, Jubilee Holdings, East African Breweries, KCB, and NMG, and 6 locally listed counters, Cipla Quality Chemical Industries, British Bank of Baroda, Uganda, and the UCL, as well as MTN Uganda and DFCU Bank. Uganda Securities Exchange or local counter index fell by 2.9%, closing the review period at 271.92 points from 280.14 points at the end of the first quarter of 2022. The decline in the local company index was on account of the share price drop on 6 local listed companies: Cipla, British American Tobacco, Bank of British American Tobacco, Bank of Baroda, Uganda, MTN, and UCL. On the annualized basis, the USE All Share Index was down 23.3% from 1,498.22 points at the end of the second quarter of 2021, while the USE Local Company Index dropped by 21.1% from 344.74. And when you look at the graph for the USE All Share Index, you can see that decline there in the second quarter from when you look at from the beginning of the month of April down to the month of June. Still, you can see that there was a decline. Now, the share price performance for the locally listed companies indicates that 2 locally listed counters, Wumeme and National Insurance Corporation, registered share price gains of over 27.5% and 5.1% to close the period under review at 239.01 shillings and 6.2 Ugandan shillings respectively. And you're looking at also British American Tobacco and New Vision Printing Publishing Company that remained unchanged at all in the second quarter at 15,160 Ugandan shillings. That said, the rest of the 6 counters, Cipla, Bank of Baroda, Uganda, Stanbic Bank, Uganda, Uganda Clays, MTN, DFCU, registered share price drops at the end of the second quarter of 2022. And Cipla Quality Chemicals, however, posted the highest drop in price to close the review period at 69 from 89 at the end of the previous period, representing a drop of 22.5%. Cipla Quality Chemical Industries share price downward trend is partly due to the low investor demand for the stock, with supply outstripping demand for the counter. And as I said on the show, supply and demand, those are the forces that determine how much a stock is going to cost. And if definitely you have supply outstripping the demand, definitely you're going to see a decline in the price. If you have demand outstripping the supply, you will see appreciation in the share price there. And then when you look at British American Tobacco, we have said nothing changed for British American Tobacco, but for Bank of Baroda, DFCU and Stanbic Bank, Uganda, the share prices continue to be affected by the Bank of Uganda's directive not to issue dividends in order to reserve capital over the discretionary payments, and which includes dividends and bonuses to shareholders. The MTN and UCL share prices declines can be attributed to, among other things, supply from retail investors outstripping the demand for the 2 stocks during the period under review. And you can see there on the last table the quarterly price movements on the Uganda Securities Exchange. The only counters that were able to gain were Uganda Clays Limited in the second quarter, and we also had Wumeme Limited, as well as National Insurance Corporation Limited. But those that lost most value Look at, for example, British American Tobacco, who lost 50% value there on the stock market. And you're looking at also Bank of Baroda, Uganda, who lost 33.3%. And you're also looking at Cipla Quality Chemical Industries, who lost 31%, as well as DFCU Bank, who lost 6.8%, and so on and so forth. That brings us to the end of that market analysis for the secondary market activity according to the quarterly bulletin for the Capital Markets Authority. It's exactly 10 minutes to midday. Now let's look at the government bonds. That is the performance of the government bonds on the secondary market. Now let's look at the primary market, however, first, and saying that Bank of Uganda issued within the quarter a total of 2.6 trillion Ugandan shillings in treasury bonds and treasury bills in the second quarter of 2022, and 16.6% lower than the 3.1 trillion that was raised in the first quarter of 2022. The decrease in debt issuance can be attributed to, among other things, the rejection of bids deemed to be highly priced. Now, when you look at the total issuance, you're seeing that in the second quarter of 2021, they issued 2.8 trillion, and in the third quarter, they issued 3.3 trillion. As well, in the fourth quarter, they issued 2.7 trillion, and in the first quarter, they issued 3.1 trillion, and which went down to 2.5 or close to 2.6 trillion in the second quarter, decreasing trend. Because, as I said, as many people have said on the show, when it comes to the debt market, when there's bidding and auctioning, definitely you have people coming on board, or the investors coming with their bids during the auction with their favorable interests, and it's up to the Bank of Uganda to actually choose the most favorable or convenient interest and drop the rest. And so those people usually have money that is 200 million and above. Those are the people that have a say in terms of what interest rate should be returned. Now, in the primary markets, the 2-year bonds yield fell while the yields on all the other tenors edged upwards. Yields on the 3-year and 5-year and the 10-year, and as well as the 15 and 20-year treasury bonds grew from an average yield of 12.1%, 14%, 13.5%, 14.4%, and 16%, respectively, in the quarter ended March 2022, to averages of 12.4%, 14.5%, 13.5%, and 14.5%, as well as 17% in the period ended under review. This increase in the yields is partly explained by a recent central bank rate increments that have pointed to a tightening of the monetary policy by Bank of Uganda in order to tame inflation. And that said, the 2-year treasury bond sold for only 9.9% in the second quarter of 2022, compared to an average of 10.5% in the first quarter of 2022. When you look at that table there, it's the quarterly evolution of the bonds, of the yields on the treasury bonds in terms of percentage. You're seeing that the 2-year bond went down from 10.5 to 9.9%, while the 3-year bond went up from 12.1 to 12.4%, and the 5-year bond went up as well from 14 to 14.5%. Then the 10-year bond from 13.5 to 13.8%, and the 15-year bond went up from 14.4 to 14.5%, whereas the 20-year bond went from 16 to 17%. That is on the on the primary market issuance. On the secondary market level, The value of the government bonds traded on the secondary market increased by 67.4% to over 16.2 trillion, and in the second quarter of 2022 from 9.7 trillion in the first quarter of 2022, and the average monthly turnover also grew to 5.4 trillion in the review period from 3.2 trillion Ugandan shillings previously. Additionally, the government bond turnover ratio for the second quarter of the 2022 period stood at 68.8% compared to the 43.6%. That brings us to the end of that analysis. You can yourself find resources on the Capital Markets Authority website by visiting www.cmauganda.org.ug, and you will be able to see some of these quarterly bulletins. They're very important for investors because they get to inform you how exactly the markets you're investing in have been performing within the last 3 months. We are going to take another quick breather. We return with our final segment where we'll be looking at a summary of the trading day yesterday and as well looking to the Nairobi Stock Exchange. Don't go anywhere, stay with us.